Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the decade in review in the 2000s. I made a video on the 2010s and it did really, really well. And I thought, well, if that worked for the 2010s, why not try it for the 2000s? Yeah, the 2000s obviously started in 2000, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the background. So I'll start with the year 1999. This was a very eventful year, but a lot of people were scared because in the previous decade, we become very reliant on technology. And there was this craze going around at the time called Y2K that said that all computers were going to simultaneously shut down on New Year's Day. So a lot of us were like, well, what are we going to do? All our credit card information, all our banking information is all going to be lost, and we're all going to be lost. So there was a lot of apocalyptic predictions going on, and um, a lot of fear in the society because of Y2K. Obviously, needless to say, Y2K wasn't a thing. Nothing happened. You know what I mean? The new year came and the new year went, and that was it. In terms of politics, well, the decade started off with Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton was a very divisive president. He was the first president in over 100 something years to get impeached since Andrew Johnson, and a lot of people didn't. They thought he was a bad representation for the morality of the White House after his affair with Monica Lewinsky in 1998. So in 1999, uh, Republican Party, his opposing party, was ready to get rid of him. So they nominated George W. Bush, the son of the previous Republican president, George H.W. Bush, while the Democrats were pretty happy with the administration of Bill Clinton, despite what had gone on with Bill, and they nominated his vice president, Al Gore. Well, it was a very close race. It was one of the closest races we've ever had in this country, and it was so close that that the decision had to be left up to the Supreme Court because of miscount votes in Florida, the state, ironically enough, where George Bush's brother Jeb was governor. Well, in the morning, they announced that Al Gore had won the election. Then, a couple hours later, they said Al Gore did not win the election, that it was still up for debate. Well, George Bush got in, they recounted the votes in Florida, and it was the beginning of George W. Bush's presidency. The first two, the first year of George Bush's presidency was pretty much uneventful. Nothing really happened, but unfortunately, on September the 11th, 2001, the United States experienced the greatest attack in our history on American soil when the country was attacked by terrorists from Al Qaeda who flew planes into our World Trade Center and into a field in Pennsylvania, but that was headed towards the White House. Now, the reaction around the world to this was just utter confusion and fear, especially in my city where I am from, New York, where it happened. We just didn't know what to do. We were scared. We were confused. Many of us who had not been keeping up with international politics at that time what didn't really know, well, why would these Islamic militants want to attack us in the United States? That was a common question that we heard all around, was like, well, why do they hate us? We were told by our president, but President Bush, that they hate us because of our freedoms. They hate us because we're Americans, and we have freedom of religion, we have freedom for women, we have freedom for, our basic liberty freedoms. But at the same time we're being told this, our freedoms were being taken away with acts like the Patriot Act, because they felt like we might have some people in our nation, Muslim and not Muslim or not Muslim, that might be sympathetic towards Al Qaeda. And we did. We had several homegrown terrorists like John Walker Lynn, an American combatant caught in Afghanistan, fighting with the Taliban. But most Americans did not side with the Taliban. In fact, most people around the world didn't side with the Taliban. And then a lot of people were not only confused, like I said, but they were hurt. And they didn't understand, well, why didn't George W. Bush do something about it the year and a half he was in office to try and stop it? I mean, Al Qaeda had attacked our embassies in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania. They'd attacked the USS Cole in 1999. Surely they must have known something was going to go down, right? That was the reaction of the American people. But we stood behind this very divisive president because despite how he had gotten in office, many believed that he cheated. It was a miscount of votes by his brother, like I said. But we were like, you know what? We're going to stick behind our president. He's our man, and he's going to smoke them out of their holes, like he said. And it it ended with us going into Afghanistan to try and overthrow the Taliban, a war that we're still in to this day. But months go by, years, 2 years go by, and still we cannot catch bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of 9/11 attacks, we don't know where he's hiding. Our troops are looking for him. We're looking for him. Can't find him. Then there's a tip in the government, supposedly, that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. That Saddam Hussein is supporting Al Qaeda militants. That Saddam Hussein is a threat to international peace. So George W. Bush and his administration, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and all of them, in 2003, get up and they basically lied to the world, telling the world that they found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And then in 2003, we go into Iraq and we overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein. The statue comes down of Saddam like this, and the statue comes down, and it's a lot of celebration on the part of the Iraqi people. But it doesn't go as planned for those Iraqi insurgents, nor for the United States. We end up staying in that war until 2011, and even after 2011, we never really win. There's a lot of attacks in the southern part of Iraq. There's the rise of Muqtar al-Sadr in 2006. It was just a disaster. And like I said, it only caused more terrorism because the entire decade was surrounded by terrorist attacks in Mumbai in 2008, in Bali in 2002, in Madrid in 2004. Just this monster of terrorism just grew and grew, and it just had the American people really on edge. like really scared of what was going to happen, especially in 2001, 2002. It's like you didn't know what was going to happen. You didn't know if you could go outside and all of a sudden an Al Qaeda militant was going to blow you up. So it was a decade defined by fear. It wasn't a decade defined by optimism like the 1990s and by peace like the 1990s. It was the opposite of the 90s. It was defined by these two wars, the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, which they collectively called the war on terror. Everywhere in the world, we were like, fighting Al Qaeda everywhere. Well, at the same time this was going on, there were conflicts around the world from the 90s that were finally ending, like when Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia got overthrown in 2000. He was responsible for the genocide of the Albanians in 1998 and the genocide of the Bosnians in 1995. He was finally overthrown in this era. Darfur was another conflict that defined this era, which started in the 90s but really rose to our attentions in the 2000s, especially during the presidential election of 2004 between John Kerry and George Bush. Now, a year after the invasion of Iraq, George Bush finds himself up for re-election. And people, at least on my side, the political left, where I vote, this was the first election that I was able to vote. I was of age in 2004. People were like, man, we got to get this guy Bush out of office. He's gonna continuously drive us into another war, possibly with Iran, because he coined the phrase in one of his State of the Union speeches back in 2003, axis of evil, which he referred to as Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. So a lot of us were scared that North Korea was next, that Iran was next. Funny, sometimes things change. As much as things change, things stay the same, right? In 2020. So in 2004 it was the same thing. And there was this rumor going around, again, just like now, that George Bush was going to reinstate the draft. Of course, he denied that in the debate. He said, I hear a lot of talk on the internets. It was a famous quote from one of their first debates, that I'm going to reinstate the draft. He didn't. But people were scared that he was. And people were like, were for sure that he was going to lose in 2004. But guess what? He won. He won again in 2004. He stood on a boat the year before with a banner that said, mission accomplished. And mission was not accomplished. Saddam hadn't even been caught till 2006. Bin Laden wasn't even caught in this decade. He was caught the next decade, 2011. Iraq continued to have problems, as I spoke about in my 2010 video, until 2011. But anyway, going back to Darfur, they mentioned Darfur in the video. And everyone's thinking, oh, they're going to invade Sudan. They didn't, thank God. Sudan issue is solved now, but it was a really contentious area that you always heard about between the northern Sudanese and the southern Sudanese as a breakup for their civil war. And it was a genocide in our time in 2004, 2005. was also the Congolese Civil War, where Joseph Kony became infamous for recruiting children in his army. It was just a really contentious time politically. What we also saw the rise of in the 2000s was Vladimir Putin. As I said in my other video, Russia was um, communism was over in 1989. The Berlin Wall came down in 1991. Russia was really weak. Russia was really on the ropes, and they didn't really throughout the 90s. They didn't really have strong leadership in the way that they would have for this decade that I'm talking about, and that's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin was a very strong leader. He unified the Russian people, and he decided in 2006 to invade Georgia. It was the South Ossetia conflict in Georgia. Of course, the United States had a problem with this, and he and George Bush had a meeting where George Bush infamously said, "When I look into Vladimir Putin's eyes, I see no soul." So we got our first taste of what was to come from Osama bin Laden. Excuse me, Vladimir Putin in the later decades, and Osama bin Laden. But Osama bin Laden was kind of the face of evil in that decade, whereas in the decade that just passed, it was Putin. So, yeah. In terms of the Middle East, and by the Middle East, I mean the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, things got even worse. In the 1990s, the world was really optimistic because Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords, and Israel finally recognized the Palestinian Authority as a state, kind of, and was ready to pull out of the territories acquired in the Six-Day War. And we finally thought, after 100-something years, that there was going to be peace between these two parties. Well, in the 2000s, all that came undone. First, you had the Second Lebanese War. Israel going to war with Hezbollah militants backed by Iran in southern Lebanon in 2006. And then you had the Second Intifada, which was the uprising of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank due to the prime minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, going on Temple Mount. Now, the Muslims in Jerusalem and the Muslims in Israel believe the Temple Mount is holy in their religion, as the Jews believe that it is holy in their religion. So, since Israel controls it, Ariel Sharon at that time felt that he had the right to go up on top of there and pray. Well, that sparked years and years of outrage, years and years of violence against Jewish people and against Israelis, and back and forth violence between the two parties that really didn't end until just very recently. But coinciding with that, we did have the first actual pullout of a Palestinian territory by Israel. Israel finally pulled out of the West Bank in 2006, but it didn't end well for them, because although they gave the Palestinians democratic rule, the Palestinians chose to elect Hamas, a faction that was very hostile towards Israel. And unlike Fatah, which was Yasser Arafat's branch of the PLO, his party, they didn't have an agreement with Israel, and they launched rockets at Israel. So 2000s was the decade that the Middle East peace process just fell to shit. Like I said in my 2010s video, it was a stalemate, and it was a stalemate because of what happened in the 2000s. The pullout from Gaza, the second Lebanese war, the second Intifada, and the pullout and the rise of Hamas. And the war between Hamas and Fatah, an internal conflict between various Palestinian factions. What about here? What about here locally? Well, here locally, we had a few conflicts, a few uproars, a few natural disasters. One of the local conflicts I can think that defines this decade was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. This hurricane was so bad that people had to sleep in the Astrodome. You saw people on the news pulling out, looting stores and just doing anything to survive. And the way the media was covering it, they were trying to cover it with such a bias that only the black residents of New Orleans were the ones doing this, when meanwhile it was New Orleansers of all races. So on one of the telethons that they had that year, telethons, celebrities come on TV and they ask people for money, for a natural disaster. They did it with Haiti, they did it with Puerto Rico, they did it with a bunch of other places, Pakistan, Japan. Mike Myers is standing next to Kanye West, and Kanye West just blurts out, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And Mike Myers just pans over and looks at Kanye West like in shock. He doesn't know what to think. And the reference why Kanye West said such a thing was that George Bush took days and days and days to respond to the needs of a majority black city like New Orleans, Louisiana. So there was a case to be made that George Bush didn't care about black people. For this, Kanye got a lot of shit from Republicans. Oh, he's race baiting. Oh, he's bringing race into the conversation. He's doing this. He's doing that. But he became a figure of racial consciousness in the black community. And the black community took him on as a martyr. And it really got the ball rolling for what would happen, in my opinion, in the decade's end. So while racial violence wasn't as bad as it was in the 90s, and it wasn't as bad as it was in the 2010s, this led the spark that I believe would eventually give birth to the election of Barack Obama. Is black celebrities like Kanye raising the consciousness of the people against the system, especially a person that we didn't even vote in, that cheated to get in, right? Okay, in terms of movies for this decade, I can only really think of one franchise that completely dominated this decade. Like in the 90s, you had the Terminator franchise that kind of epitomized the decade, and you had Titanic, which wasn't a franchise, but it was a very successful movie. In the 2000s, The franchises that dominated the decade in the beginning was The Matrix. The Matrix was something new, something different that we never seen before. The special effects were crazy, and Neo did a backflip. Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, did a backflip that was incredible. That became a dance that everybody was going around doing in the 2000s. Sierra did it in a Goodies video. It was a dance. The Matrix, woo, backflip. So that dominated during the early part of the decade because it came out in 1999. Um, but as the 2000s progressed, the franchise that um, started to dominate was Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. Harry Potter was a series of books put out by British author J.K. Rowling about this young wizard named Harry Potter who goes to a school named Hogwarts. And Lord of the Rings, of course, was um, the trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. And both of these were very unique because in the fantasy subgenre, movies in the fantasy subgenre have never really done all that well. You see it with Pan's Labyrinth, um, Jim Henson's series in the 80s. It didn't do so well. But Peter Jackson took on his vision and he created some of the most classic films that we've ever seen, even becoming the first of that genre to ever win an Academy Award. It was incredible. Return of the King is a very incredible movie, and it relaunched the career of Elijah Wood. Elijah Wood kind of suffered, in the latter part of the 90s with being in corny movies like The Good Son or Forever Young with Mel Gibson, right? But with this, as Frodo Baggins, he came back. So it was the return of it was the return of speculative fiction to the screen, letting people know that speculative fiction could be profitable. By the decade's end, even Peter Jackson is topped when James Cameron comes on the scene with the highest grossing movie of all time in 1999. In 2009, Avatar. Avatar just blows people away, starts this trend of seeing movies in IMAX, and this world is just new and innovative. And people are just like, what did I just see? It completely dominated the discussion in 2009. It was tremendous. In terms of music in the 2000s underwent a drastic change. Why? Because just like movies now, just like movies in the 2010s, music in the 2000s had to confront technology. You had the invention of iPods, the invention of Napster, the invention of Kazaa, the invention of Morpheus, the invention of LimeWire. All these different ways to obtain music via the internet that was in competition with record sales. So artists weren't doing so good like they had in previous decades because they weren't selling as much. People were illegally or sometimes legally or illegally downloading their music, so albums weren't doing so well. They tried to, when it first started, they tried to get a hand on it, like Metallica suing Napster or Dr. Dre or Eminem suing Napster. But it just wasn't going to happen. Technology had gotten away from them, just like it got away from the movie industry in the 2010s. But you still had your success stories. Kanye West was one of them with his College Dropout album in 2004. Eminem was another one. He kind of ended the 90s decade and started off the 2000 decade with his masterpiece, Marshall Mathers LP, and Encore, and the Eminem show. Encore wasn't that great, but it's whatever. Uh, Kanye West was another one. Kanye West, to me, Kanye West completely dominated the decade. Like I said, College Dropout was a tremendous album. Twisted Dark Fantasy was a tremendous album, even though it came out in um in 2010. You know, he started working on it in the 2000s, so to me it counts. He was just taking an 808 Heartbreak. A lot of people didn't like it because he was singing too much, but in a way, he was ahead of his time. Similarly, ahead of his time is somebody that I'm going to talk about right now, and that person is Ja Rule. Ja Rule came out for the first time ever in 1999 with the album Veni Vidi Vici. And it was all right. He was featured on the Rush Hour soundtrack, and he was all right, but he sounded too much like DMX. Then in 2002, he comes out with his second album, and he does this thing Between Me and You with Christina Milian, where he's like singing and rapping at the same time, combining elements of R&B and hip hop, and it just catches on, and he continues to do it, and he continues to do it, and he continues him and his Murder Inc. crew to dominate radio in the mid 2000s. I mean, early 2000s to the mid 2000s, until Eminem's protege 50 Cent comes out with his first album, Get Rich or Die Trying, in 2003. And he just has this beef with Ja, and he blows Ja out the water. Everything Ja had accomplished in the 336 album, his second album, was completely blown out the water by 50 when 50 dissed him and went out his head. First in Wanksta, then in this. 50 was a guy that he started off in 1999 with How to Rob, a funny song. Him and the Mad Rapper, they were talking about how to rob different rappers by name. And then he got shot 5 times. And then his mixtape started to circulate around the street. And Wanksta was on it. It was Power of a Dollar mixtape. And Wanksta was on it. And Wanksta caught the ear of Eminem. And Eminem signed 50 to the largest hip-hop deal ever in history in 2002. And put out the album Get Rich or Die Trying in 2003 that has songs that are still bangers to this day. Wanksta, In the Club, Many Men. It made the career of 50 Cent. It made 50 Cent a superstar. I feel like he was never able to duplicate that, but he did very well. And it was kind of the last breath of what we will come to call gangster rap, the style of heavy-handed rap music, especially from New York, especially from California. So Dre and 50 kind of collectively kind of moved away from that. Because while that was happening, the South was coming up. And the South had a sound that was defined by crunk and was defined by the albums of Lil Jon, the East Side Boys, and their song, Get Low. It was a stripper's anthem, and women could love to dance to it, but it just got you on your feet. Nuck If You Buck was the same kind of a song. Nuck if you buck, boy, nuck if you buck. And it was just, I don't know, I just have so many fond memories of that song. Back then in the 2000s, it was the crunk sound, straight from Atlanta, and it was centered on clubs. It wasn't lyrical music. It was just centered on clubs, and that sound pretty much dominated the latter part of the decade from 2005 onward on the radio. Another dominant person in music in the beginning of the decade was Usher. Usher came out with his Confessions album in 2004 after his breakup with Razonda Chili Thomas and his outside relationships, where he was just bearing his soul. Songs like Burn, songs like You Got It Bad, right? Were songs that were really personal confessions, part two. They were songs of a deeply personal nature that made that album, Confessions, and the album before that, classics, classic albums. Another person that I say cemented her legacy in the 2000s was Alicia Keys. Alicia Keys, Confessions of an A Minor, was one of the best albums I ever heard in 2001. She had so much talent. I hadn't seen talent like that in a woman, in an R&B singer at all. She kind of epitomized the neo soul type ethics that um that we were all attracted to. Outkast also with their Stinkonia album in 2002. Once again, bringing the South to people's attention. Now the South completely dominates music, but Outkast in the early 2000s one of the first to do that. You know, but it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about music in the 2000s if you didn't talk about this person. Before I move on to continue this person. And this person is Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson died during, excuse me, not to laugh, but he died in 2009. His death was tragic. I cried myself when I found out. He was redeemed in 2009 when he passed away. Because before that, earlier in the decade, Martin Bashir and ABC had put out a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson, in which Martin Bashir portrayed Michael Jackson as a bad parent. They portrayed him as a pedophile, which eventually led to his criminal trial in 2005. He was found acquitted on all charges, but after the trial, he never again returned to making music. And he was just about to do so on the This Is It tour in 2009 when he died. It was just sad and tragic. In terms of um, international music, reggaeton, the Spanish tinged style of reggae that was created in the 1980s by El General in Panama, finally made its way to mainland United States with such hits as Oye Mi Canto, the Lean Back remix in 2004, and Dale Con Dale with Don Omar. They even had a Spanish reggae segment on Hot 97 with DJ Cormega. So um, it was the beginning of reggaeton, and it was for a while. It was a craze in 2004, 2005 ish. because nobody had ever heard it. Sean Paul, the same thing. Sean Paul took dancehall reggae with his album Get Busy and just blew up the charts. You know, he introduced us to what he called dirty rock. Dirty rock. And it was the first recognition that international artists like Sean Paul and like Daddy Yankee had ever really gotten, and Rupee too, and Kevin Little. West Indian artists and international artists don't often get that kind of recognition on the American charts. So, but in the 2000s, they did. They even did a remix of Get Low, where they had a Spanish version, they had a Jamaican version, and they had a regular version of that song. So, in the mid 2000s, definitely that music became prominent. Um, what else? In terms of death, besides Michael Jackson, like I said, it was the death of Aaliyah and Left Eye. Aaliyah and Left Eye left us in 2001 and 2002, respectively. And that, to me, was a huge blow to female representation in music, because these two were on the cusp of doing something big. Left Eye was on the cusp of becoming a singles artist, while Aaliyah was on the cusp of coming out with a movie career after she made Romeo Must Die. So I miss these two. I always think about them, and I always think of what they could have been in the music industry had they survived. Um, in terms of sports, I don't know, the Yankees won the World Series in 2009. It's pretty much all I know. Sorry, guys. Again, I don't really. Sports is not really my thing. And in terms of professional wrestling, now you know I gotta go there. I did it in my other video, so I gotta go there with this. Um, Professional wrestling started off the decade. This was a decade of major changes for wrestling. Major changes. They were very successful in the Attitude Era, the most successful era that they ever have had in their history. Competition with WCW from 1995 to 2001, and then 2000. In the year 2000, they became a publicly traded company. They started trading their company in the stock market, the Nasdaq. But in 2001, they purchased their competition, both opposing companies, ECW as well as WCW. And they had their most successful WrestleMania of all time, but the end was no good. It was in Houston, Texas, and they turned Stone Cold Steve Austin into a heel. They turned him into a bad guy. They had him aligned with Vince McMahon. So you just had your most profitable star, who was a good guy, turn into a bad guy. You're shitting down everything. Well, they didn't have a plan for the WCW invasion, and it didn't work. They didn't have the guys, because most of the big game guys in WCW were signed to contracts from Warner Brothers, Time Warner. Because what happened was AOL merged with Time Warner, and the heads at AOL, they didn't want to be associated with wrestling anymore, so they took WCW off the air. So WWE bought it, but a lot of the wrestlers had contracts with AOL Time Warner and not with WCW itself. So the contracts WWE bought out were not the big time main event stars like Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, the NWO, or Goldberg, or Rey Mysterio. All these guys sat out for months and months. So the invasion in 2001 amounted to basically nothing except for a classic match at SummerSlam between Kurt Angle and Stone Cold, which we would have got anyway even if there was no such thing as an invasion. You know? So it went nowhere. And then in 2002, um, Vince McMahon announced that the NWO was coming back. He had this famous promo where he said, I'm gonna inject the WWE with a lethal dose of poison. The NWO. and and then the NWO comes out, and it's crazy because it's like you're finally getting a chance to see Hulk Hogan back in the company that made him. That he hasn't been there for 12 years. He hasn't been there, and he's finally back. And and fans are cheering for him over The Rock. The Rock is one of the most successful wrestlers of the 90s. But in 2002, when Hulk Hogan came back, fans wanted him. They didn't want The Rock, especially when they had the match at WrestleMania 18. When he started hulking up like this and doing this and is doing this Three Stooges deal, the place just exploded, and then he turns into a babyface. But then not like you're like, okay, now what do you do with the NWO? Well, what they tried to do was they had Shawn Michaels come back and join the NWO until Kevin Nash tore his quad in a 10-man tag. Scott Hall had already been kicked out previously because of drug problems, so he wasn't really going nowhere, And once Kevin Nash tore his quad in that 10-man tag match on Raw, there was no point in having the NWO anymore. So Vince McMahon comes out, announces that the NWO is dead. He says there is no more NWO. And then he says, we're going to shake things up on Raw. We're going to split Raw into SmackDown versus Raw with two competing general managers. One, Stephanie McMahon for SmackDown, and the other, to the shock and amazement of the fans, the competitor who competed against Vince McMahon in the 90s, who was the brain behind Ted Turner in WCW, Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff comes out, and they hug. It's like, it's amazing. Like it's something every professional wrestling fan never thought they would see. In fact, they did a backstage segment prior to that where Booker T is talking, and Booker T looks up. He's like, he says to his wife, Sharmell, tell me that I did not just see what I just saw, and and then it's like Eric Bischoff comes out. He becomes the general manager of Raw. He has feuds with Cena, feuds with Stone Cold Steve Austin, who's a retired general manager himself, and that's it. You know what I mean? But one of the rising stars in 2002. This is why the decade, the best year I love in wrestling is 2002. Because not only do we see Eddie Guerrero come back, not only do we see Shawn Michaels come back, not only do we see the NWO come back with Hulk Hogan, we see a lot of returns. When we see the debut of Brock Lesnar, and we see Brock Lesnar at that time called the next big thing, he was so dominant. I mean, he became the youngest WWE champion of all time when he defeated The Rock in Nassau Coliseum, and the crowd switched on The Rock again for this newbie, just like they had done with Hulk Hogan in the same year. And then he wins the King of the Ring. It was incredible, 2002. 2004, we saw the birth of Evolution, the greatest faction in the history of the WWE since the death of DX. You might not have the NWO anymore, but you had Evolution. Ric Flair, Batista, Randy Orton, and Triple H. The past, the future, and the present. And they were a very dominant faction. They were so dominant that they competed against Goldberg, who made his debut the night after WrestleMania 19, which is still one of my favorite decades in professional wrestling. One of our favorite years in professional wrestling in the decade of that event, WrestleMania 19. Brock does the shooting star press and almost breaks his neck. And then you're like, oh my God, oh shit, Brock Lesnar broke his neck. And the last match between Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock before Stone Cold Steve Austin retires. And a year later, The Rock would retire and leave professional wrestling in 2004, not to come back again until 2011. So it was an era of saying goodbyes and an era of saying highs. Saying highs to Brock Lesnar, who only stood 2 years. See, that's the thing. The original run of Brock Lesnar was only 2 years. He was there in 2002. He was gone in 2004. I was there in the Garden when he had his last match with Goldberg, and Stone Cold Steve Austin was a special referee, and the whole place booed him out of the building. You know, because they knew they were not coming back. He wanted to try to go to the NFL, but then that didn't work out, so he went to the UFC and became UFC champion. I spoke before in my 2010 video about how that went down. John Cena in 2005 with his defeat of JBL at WrestleMania 21, he became the dominant man of the decade, to the point where by 2007 fans were completely sick of him, calling him Super Cena, lashing out against him on the internet, saying that he was pushed, he was too overhyped and everything. But by 2005, he still had his rapper gimmick, basic thugonomics, kind of come out, don't see me, can't see me, can't see me. He would do the rap thing. Yeah. So, but by decade's end, because YouTube rose up in 2006 and Facebook rose up in 2006, we started to see people in entertainment become way more vocal. Entertainment fans. So like I said, in the wrestling community, people didn't like Cena. People sometimes they didn't like Randy Orton. They didn't like the direction the product was going, and they switched it. They did the same thing for politics as well. They didn't like something, just like I said in early when I was talking about the politics. I said the people on the internet said there was going to be a draft. They were really vocal about it. So in this era, people became vocal about their opinions, whether it's be something stupid like wrestling or something important like politics. People became vocal about their opinions, and they were able, with the launch of social media, to use their opinions as a platform to express their pleasure or displeasure. YouTube became a thing. Thanks to high-speed internet, which became a thing, DSL, and then broadband became a thing in the 2000s. Facebook launched in 2004. MySpace, which went away. MySpace was completely dominant in the beginning of the decade, but completely nothing by decade's end. And then, to closing out the wrestling portion of my talk, I'll say one of the greatest matches I've ever seen happened in 2009. The Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels in Houston, Texas, at WrestleMania 25. That match still blows me away. And that's pretty much it for wrestling. Oh, and we saw the rise and fall and epic failure of Vince McMahon trying to launch a football league called the XFL in competition with the NFL. It didn't work, but now he's doing it again. So I don't know if he thinks it'll work this time. In terms of television, in the 2000s, television was completely dominated by reality shows. Shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, shows like Survivor, which it started with, and shows like American Idol. American Idol did become a launching pad for various musical artists like Kelly Clarkson, like Clay Aiken, like Ruben Studdard. I still love Ruben Studdard's song "I'm Sorry" 2004. I still listen to that to this day. And "Flying Without Wings" was a song they used for my graduation, which I graduated that year in 2003 from high school. You know what I mean? So American Idol really did put an imprint on people's memories. I was at the prom when they announced the finals between Ruben Studdard and Clay Aiken on the second season of American Idol. It was a phenomenon. Everybody was watching it. You know, people love to hate on Simon Cowell, and people were happy to see Paula Abdul had come back. Another person that made a comeback in 2005 was Mariah Carey. You know, Mariah Carey had a breakdown. Uh, she wasn't as successful as she was in the 90s, but with the emancipation of Mimi, that song "We Belong Together," she knocked it out the park, and she showed why she's still Mariah, why she's still one of the top vocalists in the world in in 2005 with that. You know, and then and then I think, to me, overall, um, the 2000s was defined by a lot of a lot of, like I said, the rise of reality shows. Trump became a reality star with The Apprentice, and eventually led him to become the president. Trump became a WWE star in 2007. You know, you know, crazy. So it was a decade of contrast, really, just like every other decade. But in this decade, even though we had a lot of problems going on, everybody was scared. Y2K initially, like I said, um, Iraq War, Afghanistan War, paranoid about the next terrorist attack. When's it going to happen? Where's it going to happen? Multiple terrorist attacks. You know, not trusting really your neighbor. We still managed to have a lot of fun. We still managed to get it crunk. We still managed to get it popping with reggae and reggaeton. But unfortunately, and the economy did really well with a tech boom, with the launching of YouTube and Facebook and Google. But unfortunately, the party was not going to last, because in 2008, the economy crashed and we experienced the worst recession that we ever experienced in American history since 1929. You know, the government was forcing banks to give out these loans to people who couldn't afford them, and they couldn't pay them back. And that unfortunately caused the banks to go under in 2008, 2009. So it was fear that started the decade and fear that ended the decade. So they were kind of bookends. But in between that, we had Eminem performing at the 2002 Grammys with Elton John. There's a lot of crunk music, a lot of good times, a lot of fun times. I was in college for most of it. And yeah, people were talking about this kind of stuff, you know what I mean? And, you know, worrying about the war on terror. But in the end of the day, we all knew Bush was behind it. You know what I mean? There's a famous song by Jadakiss. He says, "Why?" He says, "Why did Bush knock down the towers?" You know, because like I said, they knew Al Qaeda was coming for them in the beginning. They did nothing about it. So most of us and the normal people, at least initially, while it settled in, we didn't really let it get to us. We just tried to have as much fun as we could. and we got it crunk, boy. That was the crunk era. From the window to the wall, that was the crunk era. I look back fondly with that era, man. It was very fun era, very fun. It was a little bit scary, the economic crisis towards the end, and Y2K in the beginning, and 9/11. But in terms of music and entertainment, it was really fun. The noughties, the 2000s. Shows like How I Met Your Mother, shows like The Office, shows like The Sopranos, shows like Oz that would captivate you every week. Family Guy started to become really popular and take over and take animation to another level. It was just a time of tremendous conflict, just like the 2010s. You know, the world was in chaos, but we still managed to make it work, and we still managed to have fun. And then by the decade's end, we saw the election of Barack Obama, the country's first African American president. And I always say, when I think of the 2000s, I always think of the rise of a president and the death of a king. Because we had Barack Obama be elected amid the amid the financial crisis that was going on, amid the two wars. We still hadn't gotten Bin Laden yet, you know. But he rose up, he promised us hope and he promised us change. But rising down was a man whose influence in popular culture made that possible, and that was Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson broke down racial barriers in the 1980s that made Obama possible. If it wasn't for him, Obama wouldn't have probably not been elected. So it was the rise of a president, the fall of a king. And we'll never forget him. You know, we'll never forget the fun times and unique times that we had in the noughties, in the 2000s. Peace.